So this next session on the schedule, for those of you that are kind of new to these Keystone Science Reviews, panel members grill the Pebble consultants to get clarifications and additional information and maybe give some first impressions. So we've got a couple of panel members that are going to take the lead on the wetlands and vegetation. Larry Guff and Bob Naiman, and if we could get you guys and Chris to come up to the front here. And so Larry, I think you need to scoot down a chair, or you guys switch your nameplates or something.
That's what we are today.
All right, and so the two panelists have some PowerPoints where they've listed some impressions and some questions they'd like some clarification on. So why don't we start with that? Larry, if you could come up and go ahead, and Bob and Chris, if you need to rearrange your chairs so you're not blinded, go ahead.
Just use the arrows to advance.
Yeah. Okay. The down arrow? I think so. Okay. Yeah. Okay, this the discussion this morning on vegetation I was very interested in, and I appreciate the work that Chris has done. There are some things about the report that stand out, and I think they deserve to be recognized as being outstanding. First of all, the references that were used are pretty standard, but they're up to date and very, very excellent. The geographic and ecosystem coverage was impressive, I thought. The study represented a very objective approach, and that's appreciated. You could tell that the researchers were confident in what they were doing. Okay. Yeah. And they displayed a lot of confidence in their work, which was good to see. There was the use of the digital data sets was up to date, and I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think that the LiDAR and the hyperspectral imaging could have been done any differently, that it was done in a proper way. So these items I feel deserve to be mentioned as being very adequate and a job well done. There are also some things, however, that need to be clarified. And I'll sort of do this as an interactive process with Chris, if that's all right. I guess what I'd like to know is, was there any use of the geology or geography that was published at the time in the selection process for your sites? For example, the work that Tom Hamilton did, I know that was, 2007, so it was a little bit after you guys were out there, but were you able to use his data or Karen Kelly's work?
Tom Hamilton's work was, most of the field work for the mine area was completed by 2006 and 2007, so it was a little late to incorporate Tom's work, although we have it, and it's great, and we're using it for kind of in other ongoing studies. The mine study area also overlapped with Mark Rain's small pools study. Mm-hmm. He did a study on, you probably have seen it, on rainfall and its kind of movement through the groundwater system. And Mark's conclusions helped us to kind of correlate water quality data that we collected at water bodies with an HGM type. And connectivities tend to be really low. Less than 20 is pretty common. So we had some cutoffs if sites were depressional wetlands or flow-through wetlands.
All right. Yeah, I don't know if did you use Karen Kelly's report at all, or?
I'm not familiar with that
Okay.
reference.
All right, I can show that to you later.
Okay.
And I was wondering about the evolution of your work with time. That's always an issue when you have something that goes over 5 years. Would you comment on that a little bit? Were you able to settle on a pretty standard protocol right away, or did you have to change that as time went on?
There was quite a bit of refinement, and especially in the years covered by the EBD. The methods were refined. The vegetation classification was kind of an ongoing process, and the final mapping for the entire area wasn't completed until the end. So data, for example, field data that was collected in 2004 incorporated refinements in the methods, even refinements that occurred in 2007 or 2008.
And I've got a bit of a interest in the non-vascular species, and I noticed that you just didn't have very much expertise, I guess. Is that correct?
Yeah, non-vascular plants were not included in the methods.
Right. Yeah. Do you have an idea of their importance as far as these individual vegetation types, your project vegetation types?
For the scope, I can't speak to their importance for use in the wildlife habitat mapping. I defer that to the wildlife biologists. And for the purpose of the vegetation study, there is one technique to use non-vascular plants, although we didn't have the conditions within the area to use that technique. So I'm not sure that it's a gap within the context of how the information was used for these studies.
Okay. Yeah. Point 4, I think you've covered. You handled that fine. This is one area that I'm particularly interested in, is the interaction of the soils and the vegetation studies. It seemed to me like you started out with the soils work and then worked in the vegetation. Is that correct? Or what was the sort of the timeline of those?
Soils and the vegetation and wetland studies were coincident.
Okay.
So much of the soils data was collected during the wetland delineation plots when those soil pits were dug. We worked with Doug Van Patten in the field. Doug did the majority of the soils field work for the soils EBD. I believe Doug was out there in 2007.
So the teams that you had that were dropped off and then were picked up later, they had a soil scientist or somebody that was felt comfortable with doing the soils work as well as the vegetation?
Yeah, there was often sometimes there was a soil scientist, someone like Doug Van Patten, who would rotate through the field teams.
Okay.
And Doug is a trained expert Alaskan soil scientist. In the absence of someone like Doug, the field teams always had two scientists, and one of those was always a wetland scientist who was very experienced and comfortable with their ability to identify soils.
And I know what happens when you get out there, that you become quite familiar pretty quickly with the vegetation types, and you can sort of anticipate what you're going to find in the soils. That's good. number 6 is something that hit me the other day when we were out flying the transportation corridor. Looking at the white spruce, it looked to me like, I don't know what the proportion of dead versus live white spruce is, and I quite frankly don't know where you are in the beetle kill issue. I mean, has it peaked now, or is it on its decline, or do you have any idea what's going on with the beetle kill?
It seems like most of the damage has been done.
Has been done.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you can't help but wonder what climate change is going to be like in 30 years and how that's going to affect. I mean, if the white spruce epidemic right now is a result of climate change, you know, what other things are going to come up and alter the landscape? It's something that I sort of keep in the back of my mind and wonder, you know, what the long-term implications of climate change will be for that area. Mm-hmm. And, well, you know, for the whole state, but for that area in particular. Let's see. Yeah, having to do with reclamation. Did you ever have conversations with PLP about reclamation in the future? And have they used that information in any way?
Yeah, we have. One of the purposes of the vegetation work was to identify dominant species and species frequency and so on to help the reclamation planners in their post-mining aspects of the project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And have you guys talked to the usability people at all, or DNR? You know, the guys that go out and inspect the reclamation work up there?
Yeah, we have. We've worked with DNR and usability. We've also worked with the people at the Chewitna coal mine, and HDR has worked on their reclamation plan. And in addition to that, Dr. Chin Lu Ping, he was the main soil scientist for usability.
Right.
We worked with him a little bit on this project, but mostly on other projects, and we discussed reclamation extensively with him.
That's good. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, now that you've done this study, what do you recommend for some sort of long-term monitoring that should probably accompany the new mining activity?
That is a great question. I think I would defer that to PLP to recommend additional work.
All right, we'll let that one go then. Yeah, I guess we've covered number 9 already. Yeah, I'm just curious, has any of your work resulted in any changes out at the mine site? You know, as far as what they're doing at the pads where they're drilling and that sort of thing?
You know, specifically, like I can say in general, the work is being incorporated by PLP, especially for avoidance and minimization. The planners have our wetlands data set, and the intent is that information, as the mine plan evolves internally, that information is included in the planning process.
Okay. I think number 11 you've already answered, so we'll go on. Yeah, this is kind of something that I know that I don't think NRCS has any soil pedons out there, do they?
No.
We sort of talked about this last fall a little bit, but have you thought about talking to them about establishing pedons out there?
I have not talked to NRCS about that in particular. I believe that I know that NRCS did conduct a soil survey in an adjacent district.
Whereabouts? I'm sorry.
I think in the Nushagak.
Okay.
And one of the soil scientists on our team was part of that field crew. I think that field work was conducted in 2010. I'm not positive about that date.
Yeah, there's been some work in the Caps coal field.
Okay.
It's about 30 years old, but there's some good soils and vegetation published in that area, which may be of some help, and I can get you those references.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the threatened and endangered species, I think we'll cover that at another time, so we won't need to touch on that. We've already pretty much covered number 15. And we've covered number 16. Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that there's only one species that is considered to be rare or endangered out there. There's another one that you might want to check on, this cryptantha. It's in the Aleutians also, but it's probably, its range might overlap with your area.
Okay.
So you might want to check that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's about it.
All right, and I guess before Larry and Chris give up here, I'd appreciate an explanation of NRCS and soil pedons. What the heck are those things?
The NRCS is the natural, what is that? NRCS. Yeah, right. It's the old, it's Soil Conservation Program. NRCS is involved with doing soil surveys all over the state, and they've particularly, for example, when the Hall Road was put in, they established study areas that are permanent, and they call those the soils that they dig and study at that site are called pedons. And so they established these areas around the state that they monitor over time. And it would be good to get them to possibly do some work out in the Pebble area.
Okay, thanks, Larry. I guess we'll have Bob come up, and he's got a...
You can stand about like 6 inches away is fine.
Yeah, okay. And then to advance it, it's just,
Either
yeah.
down or the right.
Okay. Well, great. Well, good morning, everybody. I was asked to look at just two chapters, chapters 14 and 39, which dealt directly with the wetlands and water bodies. And I looked at them largely from the point of view in terms of kind of technical competence. Did they meet the objectives that they said they were going to meet in terms of characterizing and inventorying the wetlands and water bodies? And I have to really echo what Larry had to say about the vegetation, is that my job was really quite easy. Despite the chapter, one chapter was, I think, 347 pages long. The other was about 50 pages long. But once I started to read them, I realized that these folks really did an excellent job. They were competent. They understood what they were doing. They were using the established protocols, established methods. They were applying them in the right ways. And in terms of the technical competence in producing an inventory of what's there, you could quibble about a few small things, but basically it was a study that was done very, very well. So I really don't, Chris, congratulations, or it was a job well done on that. I do have a couple of aspects that, in going forward, that they may want to consider. And first of all, back up just a little bit. I know how complicated and how much effort went into these kinds of investigations. Basically, when you're doing an inventory, you're creating an accounting sheet of what you've got out there at one point in time, or in this case, one period of time. And early in my career, I did very similar things in Canada and very similar terrain. And it's a tremendous effort just to get this inventory together. But that, despite all of that effort, now really the hard work begins. And I say this, I'd like to say this in terms of going forward, because now we get to the very, very hard part of the effort here. And there's a couple of things that I'm sure the people who did these studies understand this very well. I'm more or less trying to articulate them for those who aren't as familiar with wetlands and wetland inventories. But first of all, these inventories really in themselves don't reflect issues such as water quality in terms of, for example, temperature, trace elements, or other microcontaminants. You can't get that kind of information off aerial photos. The second thing that it doesn't tell you much about, but becomes very, very important when you're trying to put some sort of an enterprise on the landscape or in the watersheds, is how resistant or resilient each of these wetland types would be to some kind of human disturbances. And of course, there's all kinds of human disturbances. But are they able to actually absorb the impacts and continue to function well going into the future? Are they able to resist them? Or if they are disturbed in some serious way, do they have the resilience to return to a stable and kind of a vital condition within a reasonable period of time? And I think that's going to remain unknown. That's essentially kind of one of the next steps here is to determine their sensitivity to certain kinds of disturbances. And then finally, and Larry brought this up as of others, these kinds of inventories don't often tell you much about the existence of species of concerns, whether they're plants or animals. Okay. Whether they're plants or animals, it really doesn't tell you whether or not you will find them there. You can develop models, habitat or species habitat models, which will help you in determining whether or not species of concern are there or might be impacted. But this still, as near as I can tell, remains to be done. Now, these are all issues, and there's several others. Larry brought up a couple of them that have to do with climate change, other, say large-scale influences like long-range transport of atmospheric pollutants coming in from China, China or the or Asia, as industries develop there and so forth. All of these are the sorts of things that are going to be. You're going to need to have investigations on in order to understand them better as the process goes forward. But anyway, this is really outside the scope of the original objectives of these two chapters. The two chapters on inventory were done very, very well, but now the really hard work begins, and these are things for the future. One last thing that I was curious about, and that has to do with beaver as well as fire in this case. But beaver are vitally important in wetland dynamics. We see this, at least in my investigations over in Alaska as well as in many portions of Canada. when you look at what creates and maintains a lot of wetland types are beaver and beaver activities. But they were not mentioned anywhere in the chapters that I read, at least that I could find. And when beaver are present, of course, and many of you know this, when beaver are present, wetlands become very, very dynamic. Over a period of a relatively few years, they will change their size, their height, the kinds of vegetation you might find there. And during beaver population booms, you'll have certain kinds of beaver impacted habitat everywhere, but then when they're predated on by wolves or they succumb to disease and so forth, those structures will start to go into a state of deterioration and decline over time. So the wetlands in themselves, where beaver are an important player in their creation and maintenance, can be very dynamic in time and in space. And one of the questions in my mind in terms of the snapshot that was taken where we have this inventory, if indeed beaver are important, is how temporally stable they might be over time in terms of the relative proportion of various wetland types from one time period to the next. So I guess maybe that's one question for you, Chris. It's the only question I do have, but the rest I think were covered quite well in Larry's presentation. But perhaps you could address the beaver issue for a little bit.
Yeah, and in many of the floodplains, habitats are highly influenced by beavers. There is data in the mapping and in the field data to kind of document baseline conditions. Every polygon that appeared to be influenced by beaver activity, wetlands that were kind of within the influence of a beaver backwater and so on, those polygons were noted with a modifier to the code. And there were many layers of aerial imagery that were used for the mapping. We decided on one layer to produce this snapshot in time, so that the beaver habitat for that year is captured uniformly throughout the project area.
Along those lines, just a follow-up question. I assume that you have aerial photographs of the area, or at least partials, that were taken in previous years, that you could get a picture of just how temporally stable the wetland types were over time?
We do not necessarily previous years, but subsequent years.
Subsequent years. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you. Milo, that's really all I had to say.
Okay. Well, okay. The big boss is temporarily out of the room, but we are quite a bit ahead of schedule. And I think the plan is that we can go ahead and...
Lunch is here.
Lunch is here.
Yeah,
Should we
unless
do
there's
that?
any more discussion that they want to have amongst themselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bob and Larry, are there more questions that you would like to ask Chris?
I've got a follow-up question about the white spruce stuff.
So
And
could we have you guys move over to your microphones, because we have a large audience on TV and on the web.
Yeah, this whole white spruce epidemic thing is really of interest to me. And if it's been going on for a number of years, have you noticed a successional change in the vegetation where it's died off, or is it too early to see that yet? I mean, what changes are occurring in the landscape because of the demise of the white spruce?
It's probably too early for me to just make kind of general observations. I can think of a few instances where it appears that the understory, particularly the shrubs, have come up a bit more. Their densities have increased,
Mm-hmm.
and they're taller. But it's I just don't think enough time has necessarily passed to make larger observations about it.
Well, I have one question, Chris, and this is really outside the inventory that you did do, but it's something that's on my mind a lot, I guess because I deal a lot with kind of the long-range big issues that affect areas over large swaths of land in different parts of the world. And one of the things I know that we see in Washington and Oregon is a lot of long-range transport of pollutants from the atmosphere that are coming out of the industrialization of China and all throughout Asia. I don't know whether or not you're downstream of a lot of this industry, but if indeed you are in this area with all the wetlands, could you say something about the ability of the wetlands to absorb this kind of atmospheric deposition and what might happen if the area was developed through mining?
That's a good question. Thank you for that. It probably is too far outside of my area of expertise. There is a trace element study. I know that vegetation samples were collected as a part of that study. I'm not sure if it addresses transport of pollutants from Asia or not.
Yeah, so earlier, both Larry and Bob brought up a couple of questions about potential future studies and the uses of this particular study and the planning process. And so I think Charlotte McKay from Pebble is willing to come up and address some of those issues.
Is it done?
I'm not sure if it is. Maybe you can do it from the table.
Okay. Thank you. So the question.
Back off just a little
Back
bit.
off. Okay, I've heard that before. The question was how we were using the wetlands data and how it relates to reclamation and what other uses we'll use it for. And so it goes into the permit applications that we do for the 404 wetlands permit at the site. It'll also support the NEPA analysis for alternatives analysis as they look at the proposed projects and other project alternatives that could be developed. And it does get used internally as we work to avoid and minimize wetlands as we design the mine site. So when we look at what we do want to propose and how we might design a road, we have the mapping. It's part of why we started it way in the very beginning when we first got going, so that we would be able to see where the best wetlands were, which were the worst places to put things. And so to the extent that we can, we do design around them. So, and it also goes into reclamation planning and mitigation planning as well, so that when we go to mitigate for the areas that we have impacted, we know what areas are out there that could be enhanced as wetlands or opened up to fish or things like that. One of the other questions you asked was about related issues, so water quality and that. And we certainly did collect a lot of water quality data. We continue to collect a lot of water quality data. And while it wasn't integrated within the EBD, its purpose is to be there so as they go through the NEPA analysis and do the EIS and do the impact analyses, that all that data is there to integrate at that point in time. And then beaver dams, I think Chris answered that quite well, but it's also addressed in the fish chapters in relation to fish habitat and somewhat in the mammal chapters as well. So there are a lot of beaver in some of the areas, and we're watching that.